Hello and good morning and welcome to the Comix Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club, the Kids Edition for October. Our book this month is the wonderful Criminy by Roger Langridge and Ryan, is it Ferrier?
Yeah, you got it right, Ferrier.
Ferrier, perfect. Oh God, I always struggle with the last names. It's always a trick. It's always a trick. And I want to thank all you guys for coming out here and doing the broadcast with us. Did you guys like Criminy?
Yeah.
Did you like Criminy?
Yeah.
Much better. That's much better. Much better volume there. Hey, come on in. Yeah, good to have you guys. Roger's calling in from England. Ryan's calling in from Canada. So it's an international affair today. And let's start with. Well, I always start in the same place. Comics. What is it about comics that attracts you as creators? That is how you want to work? Well, tell me about your life in comics. Roger, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I pretty much learned to read from reading comics. My mother used to go on long car journeys with my brother and I when we were very little, and to keep us quiet and stop us fighting, she'd throw Uncle Scrooge comics into the back seat with us, and so I pretty much learned to read from reading Karl Barks. For me, comics is sort of like, I think I was exposed to them at such a young age, at such an early stage of my development, that it's like one of my first languages now. It's a language I feel very comfortable speaking. So certainly that's one of the attractions of comics for me, is that I can express myself pretty clearly in that medium. I sort of know how to get what I want to say across in a way that I might not in another medium. So for me, that's a big attraction of it. And also, I think the visual and verbal combination is very immediate and very compelling from that point of view. It sort of goes straight into your brain without having to be processed very much. So that's very attractive as well.
Yeah, I think.
If you don't mind, let me just follow up on that really fast. Roger, did you study illustration? Did you?
I did a little bit of art when I was at high school, but I've never really studied illustration. No, I'm pretty much self-taught. I learned to draw essentially from copying comic books, and just doing a lot of it. Getting those 10,000 terrible drawings that everybody has inside them out of me at a very early age, because I just kept on doing it.
Very good. Ryan, how about you? What's your comics journey, as it were?
Mine it kind of had a similar start, like Roger's, in that I was given comics at a young age from my mom. And yeah, that just kind of became like my touchstone for how to read and what I was into. And I think that I kept with it my whole life. And then when it got time for me to pursue some sort of creative career, I think comics is the only medium that I felt comfortable in. Like, you can do anything in that. There's no restrictions visually to what you can do. And so I feel like it's the one medium where, because it's so collaborative, it gave me that confidence to be able to do what I wanted to do without having to worry about my own limitations, which was I can't draw at all. So, and I like that how it's a thing that I can do that's not entirely mine, but it still has a weight and importance, and I feel fulfilled doing it. So I really enjoy, partnerships and creating things. That's really special to me. And yeah, it's just like Roger said, that's how I grew up. That's what I know from communicating and telling stories. That's the touchstone I go to, is comic books. So.
Did you go to school for writing or anything like that?
No, I went to school at one point for animation, and then I quickly learned that I can't draw. So that didn't become a thing. But I've always been like involved in creative fields. Like I was a graphic designer for 12 years before going to comics full time. So I've always kind of been like the son in the family who doesn't put on the shirt and tie, that kind of thing. So yeah, but comics is, yeah.
I know the feeling. I very seldom wear a suit or tie myself, as you might be able to tell. Where did the inspiration for Criminy come from?
Sorry, Roger, do you want to take that one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was your idea initially, so perhaps you should talk about the spark, and we can sort of talk about how we built on it after that.
Yeah, the spark was that I was going through a period where I wanted to do something completely different than what I'd done before, which was either kind of 18 plus satire books, or like super, like dramas or thriller kind of thing, or like real weird books that weren't for kids, essentially. And so I wanted to do something different, and I was kind of looking back on what interests me the most, and I grew up watching old cartoons, and that was really informative for me in how I approached thinking about, world building, characters, and stuff like that. So that I was kind of like, oh, I really want to do that. And so I sent out a tweet, and I was just like, who would, is there anyone who's interested in doing comics in this kind of style? Get at me. And I don't know if I've told Roger. I'm kind of blushing now because I've told Roger this before in interviews and stuff like that, but I've never like said it outright. But like Roger's my like touchstone for that kind of style, and so it never occurred to me to ask him directly, because that's like someone being like, I want to go make an independent movie, and then going to like Robert De Niro and being like, you know what I mean? Like that's just I was shooting a little lower in terms of like what I could achieve or what would be appealing for a collaboration. So it was really like it was totally gobsmacking when Roger replied and was like, yeah, I like, this is my style, and I'm into it. And I'm like, of course you are. Like, that's, so yeah, it was very cool and awesome and humbling and inspiring. And then so there was a moment of panic then, though, because I was like, oh no, I need to have a story now, because I actually didn't have a story then. I was just like, oh crap, like my bluff has been called. So yeah, it was a lot of thinking about, I think the thing that attracts me to these kinds of stories and like the old cartoons was that they were so unique and inventive and imaginative in a way that I can't even pinpoint. I'm like, who would think to do stuff like this? Like, that's thinking, I hate the term outside the box, but it's super outside the box. And so I was it put a lot of pressure on myself to like, go further than I would typically go, or think in a way that I wouldn't think, and really focus on this kind of world building and interesting things. So I pulled a lot from what was going on in the world at the time, and what I would like to read, the kind of story I would like to read, and the kind of story I haven't told, and the kind of story I'd like to tell. And yeah, it just kind of really naturally fell into place. And I think that I kept on the forefront thinking about like a book that is for everyone to read, that's not just, placating or pandering to any audience at all, but it's just like super heartfelt and fun at the same time. So that's a long-winded way of saying it just kind of organically developed based on being able to collaborate with a hero of mine. So it's really it's one of the coolest comics inceptions that I think I've had. So I like that story a lot.
I'm blushing now.
Yeah.
How about from your point of view, Roger? I mean, obviously you just told the origin of it, but when you started working with him, how did you start visualizing these characters? What was going through your brain?
Well, the initial tweet talked about doing something in the style of a Max Fleischer cartoon, and that was kind of why I thought I would be appropriate for it, because I've worked on Popeye, I've worked on Betty Boop, you know, I've actually sort of dabbled in that world already. So that was sort of my visual touchstone, I suppose, when I was developing the world visually. I was trying to think of, you know, filtered through my own sensibility, obviously, but something that could fit into that world. Yeah, just building on what Ryan was saying, the everything but the kitchen sink kind of approach to those old cartoons was something that it seemed like a fun thing to play with. I think, you know, you've got a lot of the animation you see nowadays has a lot of strengths that those early cartoons don't have in terms of story and in terms of sophistication of technique, but they've lost a lot as well in that everything's so pared down and nothing is in those films that isn't essential for moving the story forward, that a lot of the fun digressions and sort of odd bits of subconscious detail that the animators were throwing in those old cartoons, there's no room for any of that. So that was attractive, just to be able to sort of take these digressions, do things that might not actually lead anywhere, or have things going on in the background that might not actually be relevant to the plot, but were just fun to do. And to make something that you could get something out of on repeated readings from that point of view, just looking for things that you missed the first time around. So yeah, I mean, it's an aesthetic that I'm really attracted to as well. So
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, a lot of those old cartoons, it almost seems like they were made up on the fly. You know?
Yeah, I think they would.
like they're drawing, and then they're like, well, now we want to draw this. So a steam train with a face comes in. Have you? I want to ask the kids in the audience. Have you any of you guys seen like 1930s cartoons like Betty Boop and Popeye and things like that? Yeah. Yeah, you're familiar with that stuff. Do you find that stuff funny and entertaining?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of.
Yeah.
And how about in terms of the book? Did you guys like the book? Yeah. So even though it was kind of done in an older style, it was still kind of really funny to you guys, yeah? Yeah. See, they like it. That's good.
The characters reminded me of animation.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
The real Renaissance man.
Yeah, he just said that the characters reminded him of animation, which is exactly, I think, what your intent was there.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk maybe a little bit about the process on the book. Ryan, are you writing full script on this? Are you just putting a couple paragraphs down? What's the writer's process on this?
Yeah, this one was full script, and you know, like I think Roger and I talked about it, you know, really early on, just like how do you want to approach this kind of thing, like, and 9 times out of 10, it's always been full script. I think that's kind of everyone likes working full script, but I tend to like also not get too crazy with like details and stuff like that, unless there's something very specific in my head that I see, but that's not, you know, like law or anything like that. So, but yeah, it's full script. And I remember it being a really quick turnaround too. This would have been like a year ago. I think it was, because I remember being like in a coffee shop at Christmas time, or it was snowing, and I was like, I gotta finish this whole graphic novel script. And it was a real nice time. I'm reflecting on my time with the script, but it was I remember I just wrote, I think it was like 5 or 6 pages, and that's just kind of what we pitched the series with. And then when it was finally time to, you know, get to work, it was jump in and write the whole thing in one go. So that I would have been about halfway through in October, and then I finished it before Christmas. But yeah, full script. I just kind of went nuts on it, and hoped for the best. I think it's not often that, you know, like I always feel good about my work but you miss that kind of like, you know, Roger or any artist can kind of like, oh, here's visual proof of my work. And, you know, you can kind of judge it and validate it on your own. So it's always a real scary thing for me to like submit a script to anyone, be it an editor or an artist. And, you know, that little cricket, the little bad cricket that's like telling you it's not good kind of chirps away at you. But no, that was my process, is just kind of sweating and stressing and typing and feeling good. And that's a whole, and like being in the unshowered, and that's my process to a T.
That's great. 6 weeks that's a really kind of quick turnaround on a script like this. Yeah.
Yeah, it was surprisingly quick, which was kind of cool. I actually liked it that way. It was because I mean, normally when you look at like getting a green light to get a book published, between the time it actually comes out, like upwards of a year sometimes for this kind of thing. So it was the turnaround was pretty quick, I think. And I think that's because we wanted to give as much time to Roger, you know, to comfortably feel good about the pages and his deadlines and stuff like that. But yeah, I remember at one moment being like, oh my gosh, this is really intense. Like they're really going for it. That's great. But I prefer to work that way. Like I like for me personally being very like, you know, a little pressure is good for me. But it was really nice too to get in there and really focus my attention on the story as a whole. Whereas if you do like monthly comics, like a mini series, it's you write a script that's like one part of a whole story, and then you go and you do 5 other scripts, and you do a bunch of other stories, and you know, this, that, and the other, and then you go back to the second piece. And so you have to kind of recalibrate your brain a little bit to get accustomed to the workflow. So I spent most of my pre-Christmas time was spent on this, and it was really nice. I liked it.
Super cool. So Roger, you get the pages in and the script in, I mean, and what's your process? Do you start breaking it down first? Do you start?
Well, I can show you a page. I've got some of my development, I guess, you know, from sketch to finished page, if you'd like to have a look at that. So I'll just see if I can set that up. Hang on.
We would very much like to see that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, so okay, is that? Can you see that, or are you still looking at me?
We're still looking at you.
Okay. Let me just see if I can figure out how this works.
Yeah, it's that little green button that looks like a television
window. Here we go.
Arrow.
Got it. Okay. So share that one. Right.
Oh,
so,
cool.
Okay, so can you see that now?
For a minute, but now it's just a black screen.
Oh, no.
We had it for a minute though, so you were doing something right there.
Okay. Okay, I've got. Okay,
Oh, there it is.
Oh, you got it again.
You've got the cover there, yeah.
There we go.
Okay, hang on. If I do that without going into the full screen, maybe that's the way to do it. I don't know.
We can see that perfectly.
Okay, good. So this is the rough I did initially, having gone through the script and sort of worked out pacing and what have you. This is the thumbnails that I submitted to the editor to begin with, and just to sort of give me an idea of how it was going to flow. Plan the lettering, where that was going to go, and the through line of the action, really. So after doing that, generally what I would do is do the lettering next, so that I can adjust the roughs around the lettering, make sure I'm not cramping anything, and just sort of get everything flowing correctly. Then what I would do is I would scan those roughs, which are done in pencil on a quite small scale. I would scan those and then print them out in light blue, blown up a bit bigger, and I would pencil over the top of those. The blue roughs give me an idea of where everything's going, but I can concentrate on the rendering and sort of building it up and giving the characters a bit of form at the penciling stage without worrying about any of the other considerations, like the storytelling considerations are already taken care of at that point. Then the rest of it is all digital. This is the first book I've ever done completely digitally, in terms of what you actually see on the page.
Wow.
Although the pencils were done traditionally. It was partly because of the quick turnaround. I wanted to do it digitally because it would let me save time on scanning things and on separating backgrounds and foregrounds, because I could do those in different layers of grey. So it was a way of speeding the process up. And so this is what it looked like after it was inked. So cool. As you can see, I've used grey tones to sort of do some of the work of the colouring. That would save me time at the colouring stage later.
Yeah.
So there's the colouring, or the flat colouring at least. I tend to do. I don't render things very much in colour anyway at the best of times, but because this was supposed to evoke an old-time animated cartoon where the figures tended to have flat colours anyway, I decided to make that a feature rather than a bug. So you've got the characters generally have flat colours on them, but for the backgrounds I did sort of render those a bit and put in some gradients and try to make them a little bit more like an animated background where you'd see, characters with flat lines and flat colours superimposed over fully painted backgrounds, typically, especially in those old cartoons. That was kind of the aesthetic of it. So that was what I was trying to evoke. Yep, that's the page.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's very cool. The inking stage, if you had done it like pen and paper, would you have laid down zipatone and things like that originally, or?
I used to do a lot of that, but it's very hard to get hold of now. So I would have done that digitally anyway if I'd been working that way, just because it's the technology I have available to me these days. But although I've seen a lot of recent comics where they're actually using the stuff again, it's making a comeback. So that's tempting. That's something I'd like to. I'd like to actually sort of have the tactile experience of sticking the stuff down and getting it stuck all over my fingers and all that again. Just like old times.
For the kids in the room, zipatone is it's like this kind of sticky thing that you literally cut out and paste on the page, and it has the little dot patterns and stuff, and it kind of brings texture. And it's the way that that cartoonists, instead of drawing out every little dot, used to lay down the zipatone stuff to make it easier. But of course today with digital technology, there's a filter of Photoshop something or other. I don't really get it myself.
Yeah.
To do all that. Comics production has changed quite a bit. How long, Roger, did it take you to do the book?
I was aiming for a page a day, really. I didn't quite manage that. I think it was to do sort of 88 pages. I think it took about 4 months to do it, including covers and things. So, yeah. But a page a day is ideal, but I'm getting old. A monthly book is a young man's game. Yeah, I'm sort of. It was pretty fast for me. It was a pretty fast turnaround for me.
Very nice. Yeah, no, it looks beautiful. Let's go to the kids. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
So I noticed this is Yeah. So this isn't really a question; it's like a comment. But like, I noticed how at like the end fight thing, there is this guy, whatever his name is. He's like the dog guy that supposedly came from that island with like the whatever eternal life or whatever. But I'm pretty sure he got whatever that is spaboofed, and the Grimmer thing. Did he like come back to life or something, or is that just like somebody else?
That's probably me not drawing the characters distinctly enough. I don't think it's meant to be the same character, no. But a lot of those characters in those old cartoons did look quite similar. They all had dog faces and black noses and floppy ears. So distinguishing between them was a bit of a chore. I did try to give them distinctive things like distinctive costumes and outfits and facial hair and things like that. But I may have fallen short on that particular occasion. But yeah, it's not meant to be the same character.
So, is the Grimmer Nymph or whatever, is it a she or a he?
The nymphs are, or rather the Grimmers are, they're actually genderless. They don't really have there's no boys, there's no girls. They're kind of like in Jurassic Park, the raptors were. Well, no, they were all boys, I think. But then they switched. It's confusing. They're just Grimmer nymphs. They're no. That's what they are.
It's sort of like a big insect, isn't it? And insects can reproduce without. They have an asexual reproduction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. They're very much just one thing.
Very good. Other questions? Yeah? No? Oh, come on. All right, Hammy.
Why does the Grimmer thingy basically, shoot out little star thingies?
Did you hear that?
Yeah. They the Grimmer nymph has like a dolphin's blowhole, and it sprays out they're like little star dust particles that kind of falls like snow that everyone breathes in, and it touches them.
What was your inspiration for that? Maybe was what Hamilton was asking?
Oh, my inspiration? I don't know. I had this buddy of mine, and we used to make up names for dogs that we saw, like cute dogs. And for some reason, Grimmer was a real popular one that we would use all the time. Like, oh, look at this little Grimmer. And we'd scrunch a dog's face up or something like that. And then so I knew that we wanted to have this big creature, and that was kind of just the name was kind of the inspiration for that. I like the idea of some big creature that's misunderstood.
Star thingy is supposed to do, or how did you get your inspiration for them?
Oh, for the stars? I like the idea of a monster that is actually most monsters would want to eat you and be mean to you, but the Grimmers inherently kind of do the exact opposite, and they would give life instead of bad things. I think. I don't know. Roger, what do you think? What was your inspiration in to design it? If you had any.
Well, I wanted something that really looked like something from a Max Fleischer cartoon, and there were all these kind of weird bug-eyed insect kind of things going on in those films. So that was kind of my initial point of inspiration. And they had, strange horns and things.
Yeah.
Just building on the things that were necessary for the plot. I mean, it had to have a blowhole, so that was part of the design as well. And just trying to make something that would be a little bit scary, but also a little bit funny. And that could turn from looking frightening to sympathetic really quickly. So all of those things went into the mix, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing to me what a range of emotions that you got out of that monster. Like, it's pretty amazing to see, you know, tear up, and then at the end it's really joyful, and like, so that's amazing. That's that's the stuff that I love with making comics, is just being able to like see, you know, characters being emotive like that. That's awesome.
Well, thanks. I mean, you gave me a lot to work with.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, aren't they sweet? Go for it.
Well, two questions. So the first one, is there going to be a prequel or a sequel to this?
I'm up for it if we can convince a publisher, but you know, these things aren't always up to us. It rather depends on how well the book does, I guess, and whether the editors found us too difficult to work with or not. I think we were all right.
I think we were pretty good, yeah.
And how did you come up with the names for the characters?
I tried to think of like, when you like, all the characters' names were kind of very like expressions that we use in language, in the English language anyways. So like, you know, Criminy itself is kind of an exclamation, and you have things like ditto and nada and okie, and those are all very much like slang terms, and for some reason I just kind of gravitated towards that, and I thought it was kind of cool. I don't know if it's apparent, but yeah, I thought it was neat. Bit and Bob, you know, like it's just kind of like throwaway lingo. So I thought it was charming. Yeah.
Was there one name that you liked better than another?
No, not really.
Oh, okay. All right. Other questions? No, really? Oh, come on. You guys know you want to ask something. No? All right. They're shy. They're shy. What can we do? When you're doing comics, and particularly something like this, the world building is a huge part of it. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about building this world and the unique things that are a part of it?
A lot of it was just, you know, stuff that Ryan put on the page that I tried to visually interpret, and then sent that to him, and he would bounce off that and come back with more details. And it was sort of, we went back and forth a few times, just passing the ball back and forth, and adding a little bit and then passing it back to the other one. So from his initial sort of pitch document, I did some sketches, I did some drawings of the environments, and then some of that fed back into the plot, I guess, because there were things that Ryan wanted to build on that he'd seen in my drawings. So it was, you know, really useful having two brains building off, you know, bouncing off one another, I think. It's sort of, I don't know if competition's the right word, but sort of trying to top one another all the time. So I think that definitely helped. I think we probably pushed it further than either one of us would have done on our own.
Yeah, that's like exactly what where my head was at too, is kind of very much even if there's moments where it wasn't communicated between us, I'm always taking Roger's work into consideration and letting that inform where I'm going, because as much as I could just go and write a script and not think about anything else like that, I want it to be cohesive and ultimately, like, you know, a perfect pairing of the story and or rather the script and the artwork. I think that I take a lot of inspiration and I take a lot of information from work that has a very familiar but entirely unfamiliarness to it, and so I like having things feel cohesive but at the same time completely different. So like if you look at the different places that we explore in Criminy, there's they go from these wildly different places, but you can still believe that they coexist. And I think that's really important, to grounding the reader but still changing it up and making it, exciting. And I think that there was one, I don't typically read reviews or anything like that, but there was one review that I read of the book that really was really smart, and it kind of broke down the chapters of the book and the different worlds that they visit as like forms of different governments, and that was kind of really interesting to me. I was like, oh, that was. I mean, there's some of that stuff, taking place in the themes of the book, in the more mature themes of the book, but that I was like, maybe that was kind of subconscious, and so that gets me thinking that, well, maybe a lot of that stuff is, whenever we make comics, is super subconscious, and we're not really controlling it, but it comes out in ways that we don't necessarily force into it. But I think, it's like, we wanted these different places to really have their own kind of themes and their own kind of feel, and as readers, we would connect to them in different ways, just like the characters in the story would react and connect to the different chapters. So I think, that was really big for me, anyways.
How much feedback and interplay was there between the two of you? I mean, how often was Roger sending you pages so that you could then comment on it?
When we first started, it was a pretty cool little back and forth email thing, and I remember getting Roger's like early concept sketches, and they were like works of art, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a concept sketch. It's like, that's publishable, amazing work. And I mean, that was just a thrill for me, just to see any sort of artwork from Roger that was remotely at all tied to me. So that was just super cool. And then I mean, it felt really like natural, and it felt like Roger and I have always been on the same page and clicking, and I felt very challenged, but in a really good way. Like it was more of an encouragement thing, and so like a pressure, but it was really like, oh, I'm getting pushed to do my best, just because of the chance to do this collaboration. And I think we really, just kind of mentally click on a lot of things, and it worked out really nice. And so I think it was cool with the publisher too. They were really hands off about it. And we were more or less, I guess, left to our own devices. I think they saw the value in this collaboration, and that the product would be pretty special at the end of the day, which I think it is. So it was really nice.
Yeah, no, I agree. Roger, you've been drawing comics for a really long time. No, I mean that in a good way, not in a bad way. I mean, it feels to me like the first comics of yours I saw. Could it be 25 years ago? Is that possible?
Yeah. My first published work outside of New Zealand, which is where I grew up, would have been end of '89. So yeah, sort of 28 years really.
Almost 30. I opened this store in 1989 myself. So
Okay.
yeah, about the same. How has comics changed? Or I don't know if that's too loaded of a question, but over that time frame, I mean, what would you say are the biggest differences between then and now?
I think, well, there's a lot of variety now that there wasn't when I was trying to break in. I mean, there would be... Comics is funny. Sometimes there's a lot of different genres and different styles going on, and sometimes it really contracts, and everybody's a bit scared to try anything new, and it all sort of becomes a bit samey. And when I first broke in the early 90s, certainly in Britain, things were sort of breaking out a bit. I think there was a bit of money sloshing around. You had things like Deadline coming out, which was quite exciting. A whole lot of different styles, sort of hybrid between the more traditional 2080 kind of thing and underground kind of sensibility to it. You had the publishers of 2080 at the time, Fleetway, were doing various titles with some more experimental stuff in it. So I think Viz Comic was huge at the time. So there were a whole lot of spin-offs of Viz Comic, which was like an adult humor weekly, not weekly, monthly. So there was all this stuff going on. And then, I broke in around that time. So there was room for my sort of less than commercial style. And then everything sort of contracted really just a few years after I broke in. But I had my foot in the door by that point. So I sort of hung on. But things have really exploded again in the last, 5 or 10 years. That there's been the explosion of the kids book market. There's been, the bigger publishers have been trying different things. So I feel like there is room for the kind of thing I do now. Again, I'm not quite clinging on by my fingernails anymore. And I'm really grateful because, it's a lot of that stuff is leaving cartoonists of my generation behind. So I'm hugely appreciative of having a young audience, who maybe will stick with me for another 10 or 20 years if I'm lucky. It's just that's where the next generation is coming from. So it makes a very good sense to cultivate them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I just find, your style is just so attractive to me as a reader. It's perfectly cartoony. It throws back to older material, but it's also very new and very current. And I think you're a fantastic cartoonist. I just want to express that. You guys like this stuff too, yeah. All right. It's not just me. Okay. You guys got any more questions? No? Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Why did you change the landscape from the beginning when there was, it was just a little bit, but I think you changed the landscape from when the pagoda, the Baron people, and then to the end of the epilogue.
Well, the pirates sort of trashed the town, so a lot of the buildings were razed to the ground, things were burnt and looted and destroyed. So, hang on. Do you mean at the bit at the end after they've come back to town and they've sort of rebuilt? Yeah, I imagined that that having to rebuild everything meant that they were pretty much starting from scratch. So I imagined that they'd put topsoil over all of the ruins and just built brand new buildings on top of it, but things weren't as established as they were at the beginning because they were starting again all over. So that was what I tried to get across when I was drawing the end bit.
That's grim. Like
That answer your question, okay? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? How about the adults? Any of the adults got questions?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah. Oh wait.
Oh,
I'm sorry. The mic is on. I had to check.
What were you guys into when you were 7 or 9? And what were you doing? What was your world like back then?
I was reading British humor weeklies, of which there were a great many when I was growing up. There's only like a couple left. There was one called Crazy Comic with a K, which had all this fantastic kind of off-the-wall stuff. There were board games that you could assemble that had insane rules. You'd throw a dice and the counter would move along the board game, and it would tell you to leave the room and go and find something and do a dance and then come back and continue the game, that sort of thing. I was into cartoons, obviously comics. I've always loved the work of Karl Barks. I read that throughout my life, really, never really stopped. I think when I was 8 or 9, I was sort of just getting into superheroes, but I was quite attracted to the off the wall ones. Ramona Fradon was drawing Plastic Man at the time, and I was really into that. And Shazam, the original run from DC, was going, and Kurt Schaffenberger's artwork was, he was my favorite sort of superhero artist at the time. Yeah, I mean, I grew up sort of pre-internet, so there was nothing. My entertainment had to be sort of found physically or drawn. You know, I was drawing all the time. That was a big part of how I entertained myself. I would fill these books with cartoons.
Yeah, I was when I was 7 or 7 to 9, that kind of age. I was very much discovering horror movies and fully taking advantage of the fact that my parents didn't really censor a lot of what I was watching. So it was a lot of scary movies, and then subsequently getting way too scared to sleep. So those are my sleepless years. I didn't sleep much during those times. But no, I was reading comics. I remember, I think I got my first comic when I would have been around 6 or 7, and it was I was homesick from school, and my mom went to the corner store and she bought me a grab bag. So it was like 5 comic books in one sealed bag, like all just random comics. I think there was some superhero books and some I think there would have been some like Disney style books. And the first one I pulled out was a Superman book. It was Crisis on Infinite Earth 7, and I was just like, okay, I'm hooked. So that was very much the inception of me like falling in love with comics. And it was funny too that, Roger, you mentioned British comics, because my whole family's from Scotland. My parents immigrated from Scotland to Canada before I was even born. So they used to tell me a lot about British comics. And then my grandma, who lived in Scotland, in Glasgow, she would save it, because there was no internet back then, so there's no email, and the phone calls were too expensive. So it was still letter writing. Like my mom would write letters and I would write a little letter and send it to my grandma. My grandma used to take the newspapers and she'd cut out the comic strips from the Glasgow newspaper, and she would stuff an envelope for a month at a time. So then this big envelope would come to Canada from my grandmother, and it would be a letter to my mom and a letter to my brother and I, and then there would be just like a month's worth of comic strips. So that was kind of like I got into comics between that and just random books that I would get at the gas station. And every time I went to Scotland to visit, we would get big piles of comic books there and stuff like that. But otherwise, it was that, and like mostly superhero stuff. Like I was into Spider-Man and Punisher and X-Men and stuff like that. But that was kind of what I was into. I was very much like, I was into cartoons and I was very hyperactive, weirdo nerd kid. Still am, but yeah, that was kind of where I grew up, was just loving very genre-based things. Yeah.
Yeah, Canada doesn't really have a native tradition of your own comics, right? From 20 years ago, because in England certainly there were weeklies, many weekly comics. Canada doesn't have that, do they?
Not that I noticed. I mean, like now that I'm much older and am actually part of the comics industry, like I can see, a huge existence of like Canadian comics and like a Canadian thing. But at the time, no. The only thing that I knew to be Canadian was Alpha Flight, because they wore Canadian flags, and it was like that was their thing, was that they were Canadian. So no, growing up, I didn't feel that there was a distinct identity, a Canadian identity in comics, and that's there. I'm sure there was. I just didn't know it. Yeah. I don't think that there's anything inherently Canadian in my work either. which is a shame, because I think that there's, wherever you come from and wherever you live, there's a story that's worth telling that means something. So that's probably something I'll explore at some point.
I think that stuff creeps up on you too. I wrote a book called For the Mighty Avenger a few years ago, and I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but it was pointed out to me after the fact that it's basically about the immigrant experience, which was essentially what I did when I moved from New Zealand to the UK, and there were a lot of parallels there, and it just sort of crept in. I wasn't really consciously doing that, but
Wow.
these things creep up on you. You'll go and look at something you wrote 10 years ago at some point, and you'll realize how personal it actually is, I think.
Wow. That's an amazing, that comic's amazing, by the way. I love that comic.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll agree. Well, our hour is pretty much up at this point. I wanna thank you guys for this book. I thought this was a really funny book. You guys all loved this, right? Yeah? Yeah. You'd want to read another one if there was another one? Yeah, no, that's a big enthusiasm there. So, let's make sure that your editors watch this video. What do you guys have coming up that you would like to plug, if anything?
What am I working on at the moment? I'm doing a Fred the Clown, serializing a Fred the Clown story in IDW's anthology Full Bleed. I'm working on that at the moment, and that's probably going to keep me going till the end of the year. And after that, I've got a couple of things that may happen, but nobody's actually said yes, they're going ahead yet. So nothing I can talk about at the moment, I'm afraid. But yeah, I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
I have a mini-series at Dark Horse called Death Orb, which is not for kids, unfortunately. But that goes until February or March. And I have a Planet of the Apes one-shot coming out in November through Boom. And I believe that's all that's slated. I have some other, like Roger, I've got some things that I can't quite promote just yet, but I have fingers crossed for those too.
Okay, well, fair enough. Yeah, again, I really want to thank you for this book. If you're watching at home and you haven't picked up Criminy, Hy-Vee to a comic store and do so, because this is a really special book. And I really want to thank both Roger and Ryan for taking the time to come and speak with us today. Next month's book, which you guys can pick up today if you like, you will be early, a week before anyone else, is Edison Beaker, Creature Seeker. A great name, right? By Frank Camuso. Frank, we will be doing a conversation with Frank on Sunday, December 2nd. So it's a little later. Normally it should be in November, but it's going to be in December because that's the earliest he can work it out. Unfortunately, Frank will also be on video rather than in person. But the next three after that, I already have all those books lined up, and they're all live and in person. It's going to be great. So yeah, you guys can pick this book up as well. And I want to also thank our sponsor, The Beat. And I want to thank Jordan, our technical director, for taking care of us. And that's pretty much it for this month's Kids Club. Again, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, kids. We'll talk to you next month.
Thank you for having us. It's been great.
Thanks so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.